Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on the webinar today. It's Sarah Griffin and George Papadopoulos. We'll be presenting our third annual Drugs and Devices Australia reimbursement update. So thank you to everyone who's on the call, on the webinar. Just some brief introductions and housekeeping first. So this is a webinar. You will be muted as participants, but you'll be able to ask questions in the questions box, which you can see. You're able to join either via the web or by phone as well. So you can open and close your control panel as well. And again, please submit the questions and comments via the questions panel. A brief introduction to who we are. So on my left here is Sarah Griffin from Medtechnique Consulting, business partner. Her expertise is in medical technology market access, a health economist. She's done feasibility assessments and economic modelling, and is vastly experienced in advocacy with the government. Her consulting firm Medtechnique is based in Sydney and specialising in health economics market access for medical technologies and devices. George Papadopoulos, similarly experienced in global pricing reimbursement, early commercial assessments. Also a Sydney-based consultancy, Emerald Corporate Group, and health economics, health technology assessment, pricing and reimbursement. So that's briefly us. I will hand over to Sarah, who will do the first part of the webinar for us. Thank you, Sarah.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. So what I want to do, quite often we have quite a few people that from overseas on these calls, so I'm just going to do a quick 2-minute, very, very quick description of the Australian health financing system, and then we'll move on. So Australia has a universal healthcare system called Medicare, which all Australian citizens are eligible to participate in. So, but on top of that, nearly half of all Australians also have private health insurance. So private health insurance is limited to hospital and limited ancillary cover only, and it generally excludes primary care and full cover of pharmaceuticals. So consequently, we have a bit of a strange mix actually, of a public and private hospital system. It's somewhat fragmented. There's lots of perverse incentives between the two systems, but overall it sort of muddles along quite well, and generally Australians have access to quite good healthcare, or very good, I guess, by international standards. So of interest to those of us in the medical technology sector, the medical benefits schedule is a list of procedures subsidised by Medicare. That is, that Medicare will pay a benefit to a doctor for performing that procedure. Okay, to be included in private health insurance, a procedure must be on the MBS. Otherwise, private health insurers have no obligation to cover that procedure when performed in a hospital. So we have a strange thing in Australia called the prostheses list. It's quite unique. So it only covers implantable devices, hips, pacemakers, grafts, etc. And what this enables is it allows implantable devices to receive a guaranteed payment over and above any other reimbursement for that hospital admission. So what this means is, because it's limited to implantable devices, that devices that are not implanted are at a bit of a disadvantage. And it actually, sorry about that, it actually creates a lot of perverse incentives in the system. But actually, we're going to concentrate a bit on politics in health this webinar, because this is what's affected the medical technology sector this year. So we started off the year with a expenses scandal from the then Minister Susan Ley. She had to resign from due to misuse of her expenses account. And this seems to happen every year in Australia to some politician or another. So it's a bit of a shame, because she was quite a good minister. But anyway, out with the old, in with the new. The current health minister is Greg Hunt, who was previously environment minister, which really sets you up for being health minister, I guess. But it's all about the politics, of course. And so what was the focus of politicians this year was all about private health insurance, because the rate of people taking up private health insurance and being covered by private health insurance was falling. And this was because it wasn't seen as good value. And as the government relies on private health insurance to, as they say, keep patients out of the public system, this was not good news. So it's generally, with a lot of wage stagnation in Australia and increase in costs of health insurance, it was becoming a less attractive option when you put it up against a free public hospital system. So this was constantly in the media and, the big focus of government all year. So due to this, we also had several Senate inquiries over the years. The first one was price regulation associated with the prostheses list framework, and that was really looking at the cost of prostheses list devices and how they were determined and how they compared to the public sector. So that Senate inquiry has reported. It didn't really find anything that interesting that hadn't been discussed in other various fora around the country, but it kept it in the news for a good part of the year. There's a second Senate inquiry which hasn't reported as yet, and is along the same theme, value and affordability of private health insurance and out-of-pocket medical costs. So that also will be a bit of a hot button topic, but it hasn't released its report yet. And there were several other health-related issues, but the most prominent being an inquiry into the vaginal mesh problems, and that has resulted in some of those products being banned in Australia very recently. So health has been a really big focus on the Senate this year. So when we did the webinar last year, I remember talking about how the private health insurance industry in Australia was running a very successful campaign blaming the prostheses list pricing for premiums going up. And that didn't let up this year. If anything, it increased and was very focused. So private health insurance industry, has little control over wages and hospital costs, but, they did feel this was an area that they could really focus on to reduce their costs. So even while the private health insurers have been quite successful this year in terms of profits, they still wanted to decrease their costs, and the prostheses list was seen as a really good way for them to do that by focusing on this. So as I said, the campaign continued all year and was very intense. So the campaign gained traction all year. The private health insurance industry maintained that the prostheses list prices were hugely higher than those in the public sector, and that this was a major cause of increased, just a little bit of a problem here. We'll fix it right up. Yep. And this was a major cause of premium rises. And the private health insurance industry maintained that up to $1 billion could be saved by reducing prostheses list prices. And this is in a small country, or a small population-wise country like Australia. So this was, really putting fear into the hearts of medical device manufacturers in Australia. So the government announced supposedly sweeping reforms to the private health insurance industry, and when we actually look at them, they weren't that sweeping. Mainly there was simplification of products so that consumers would really actually realise what they were purchasing. There was some tinkering around the edges for mental health access. There was some discounts for younger people to encourage them to enter the private health insurance market, but they weren't that big. I think the highest was 10%, and higher excesses were allowed to reduce your premiums, and excesses are, deductibles in America. So really not that big a deal. But nevertheless, they were, the biggest reforms that we've had for some time. But what it was really of significance to the medtech industry was an agreement signed with the Medical Technology Association of Australia with the Australian government. And this all came under private health insurance reform. So essentially the wording was the agreement was in order to promote the sustainability of privately insured healthcare through rebalancing, which is an interesting word, the cost of medical devices, to keep private health insurance affordable, improve the value of private health insurance, and essentially reducing benefits for prostheses. So the provisions of the agreement were the industry was really backed into a corner on this, and so it was, they really had to absorb some price decreases. So what was agreed to was a 303 million decrease in prostheses list benefits spread over 2 years, which is, fairly significant in, a population of 25 million, and 2 years is quite a rapid time for that to happen. But there was some nice quid pro quos, which I'll go into. So there's an undertaking to remove the 2-year evidence requirement for some devices where appropriate, my italics, or my parentheses. So what they were talking about here is there's been this really quite frustrating requirement for devices that are considered high risk, even though they were approved by the TGA, that they had to have additional 2 years of published clinical evidence of safety and efficacy, which was really difficult for a lot of companies to provide because it was a unique requirement to Australia, wasn't required in other jurisdictions, and kept a lot of devices out of the market because they just couldn't meet this hurdle. So this hopefully will be removed, as we're yet to see the rules for this, and to know what some devices and where appropriate actually means, but hopefully it'll be good news and a reduction in this really somewhat bizarre requirement. And also the PLARC, or the Prostheses List Advisory Committee, clinical groups have had a tendency to want to do an additional assessment of safety over and above the TGA, so that is going to be removed. And also the prostheses list is going to be issued 3 times a year instead of the 2 in February and August as they do now. And they're not rushing into this, but in 2019 that's planning to happen. Okay, so I'll just go through some of the provisions of the agreement. There's an industry working group, yet another. Industry working groups tend not to internally agree with each other, but anywhere the plan is to come up for a new framework for benefit setting and review using HTA, evaluation of value, cost effectiveness, and innovation and post-market review. Now, no one has any idea what that means yet, and we will just have to wait to see what the industry working group comes up with, because that seems to cover a vast area of device assessment. So we'll actually have to see what that turns out to be. The second one's very important for the industry, reviewing ways of listing new medical devices that do not meet the current criteria but are safe, clinically and cost effective. So that covers all these single-use devices that tend to be high cost but are single use and therefore don't meet the definition of implantable, which is, as we all know, very anachronistic and old-fashioned, and that term should have been rid of years ago. And also there's going to be a review of the Prostheses List Advisory Committee processes to improve the quality and timeliness of written information. So basically the transparency of the clinical assessment on the prostheses list is absolutely abysmal at the moment, and the communication is appalling. So any improvement in that will be very welcome, which leads to transparency and an understanding of how decisions are made. And by 2022, there's an undertaking to introduce the new model to recognise the value of innovative technologies. Not actually rushing into it, 2022 is a ways away, but hopefully by that time we'll have some sort of mechanism to look at innovation and including it rapidly on the prostheses list. So what are the implications? Different for different devices. So if you're in plastics and reconstructive, it's not that bad. You have a 2.5% decrease. But if you happen to be selling cardiac devices, you're going to have to absorb a 27.5% decrease in your selling price on the prosthesis list over 2 years, which is pretty brutal. So one of the implications is the medical device market in Australia is very complex. Because we've had for a long time a private sector where the price is set, that very naturally affects how prices are set in all the other sectors. And so, having reductions in one sector may absolutely lead to flow-on effects in other sectors. And there may be all sorts of unintended consequences that we're not aware of yet. That just remains to be seen, and we'll have to just watch what happens. But one good thing, there will be stability in price over the next 5 years, which will allow companies to plan and, with some sort of certainty, and that will be very welcome. And over time, it should open doors for innovative technologies in the private sector, but it's very disappointing that no timeframes for inclusion of non-implantables or any of the other reforms have really been committed to. And we are going to go through death by committee, I think, again, for those of you who are familiar with Australian health reform. So we've got 2 industry working groups, benefit setting and review, which I talked about earlier, and that's going to be very curly. And I anticipate that there will be some increased burden on industry in terms of the application process. The other one's quite interesting. It's funding for cardiac technical support services. So for anyone who works in the active implantable cardiac device area, these companies provide technical support for these devices for the life of the device, and that can be for many years. And with a 27.5% decrease in their selling price, that's likely to affect the ability of these companies to provide that support. So they're looking for, there's a committee being formed to look at other methods for funding that. That will be very interesting to see how that resolves. There's no timeframes for achieving these outcomes, which I think is very disappointing. And the plaque is also responsible for revising the prosthesis list criteria. There's no mention of public consultation, but that's not to say it won't happen. So it's all a bit vague, and I've no doubt there'll be lots of industry pressure to get a move on with these reforms, but as I said, no time frame set. Okay, so it's not only the big political focus this year has been on prosthesis list, but there's been some other stuff happening as well, but just not as noisily, I guess. So the medical benefits review, this is a review of the medical benefits schedule and the thousands of procedures that are covered under the Australian Medicare program. And so this review was long overdue, and it has the support of all sides of politics, and it's basically a review of all the medical procedures to make sure that they're up to date, in line with current evidence and fit for purpose for the present. So multiple clinical groups have released reports for public consultation, but I have to say the public consultation hasn't been very public, because you actually have to search pretty carefully to find these reports, but nevertheless they are available. And there's quite a few general themes that are relevant for medical technology suppliers. So there's a big focus on reducing unnecessary tests. So if you work in this sector, there's likely to be a lot of tightening up of indications to actually reduce usage. Colonoscopy, this is the most common procedure performed in private hospitals, which always just leaves me wondering what Australians focus on all the time. Bone density testing, that's been overused, and spinal x-rays. All of this is going to have the indications for receiving these tests are going to be much tighter, and we can expect a decrease in usage. And also, for those of you in the diagnostic area, there's some recommended restricting access to multiple pathology tests in asymptomatic patients to reduce usage. So big one that's been in focus is vitamin D testing, but there's a whole bunch of other ones as well. So those of you who work in this area can expect to see some decreases in the usage of these tests. And we'll just talk just a bit about public hospitals. So public hospitals in Australia have been funded by activity-based funding since 2013. And so this is basically DRG funding, or diagnostically related groups. And this has happened since 2013. So public hospitals are essentially paid for what they do by DRGs. And public hospitals continue to be budget constrained and will always be budget constrained because that's the nature of public hospitals. However, we have a national efficient price, which is basically the price of a single cost weight for those of you who are interested in costing procedures. But, it's actually the price of the average procedure, to put it in simple terms. And in 2017-18, that was set at $4,910. And that's up from from 4,808 in 2012-13. So that's actually, a fairly marginal increase over all those years. So the activity-based funding program can be seen to be doing what it set out to do, which is maintaining costs and increasing efficiency. So in terms of medical devices in the public hospitals, they are generally purchased by public tender. And, as I mentioned before, the decrease in the private sector prices due to prostheses list reform may make it more difficult for some device sectors to be as competitive in these public tenders as they previously were. And that remains to be seen about, how the system will rebalance following prostheses list reform. So looking forward to 2018, the multiple prostheses list reform committees will begin work, we hope. There's likely to be opportunities for industry consultation, and I urge you, if you have an interest in this area, to put your 2 cents worth in follow your industry association and follow the Department of Health website and participate as you can. There probably won't be any meaningful outcomes till 2019 because the Department of Health is not known for its speediness or actually keeping to their own deadlines. But nevertheless, it'll be interesting to see if the prostheses list reforms result in any modification of private health insurance premiums as was claimed. Oops. Okay, I've just clicked onto George's first slide. So we'll take some questions at the end, but I'm just going to hand over to George, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, let's keep going. So there's a lot of things happening in the pharmaceutical sector and reimbursement in Australia in the last 12 months since our last webinar last year. But I thought I'd this year just concentrate on 3 aspects. The department's undergone some interesting structural changes, especially related to the pharmaceutical division. So we'll kick off with that. And then the 2 main industry bodies in Australia, Medicines Australia and GBMA, the Generics and Biosimilar Medicines Association, both signed and agreed to quite wide-ranging compacts, what used to be known as Memorandum of Understandings or Agreements. So let's kick that off. There are 3 buckets for this webinar. Again, just an overview for people who don't know how the Department of Health is structured. At the top of the hierarchy is the responsible minister. In this case, it's Minister Hunt. Beneath that is the Secretary of the Department, and then the Deputy Secretary who looks after the groups of divisions. First Assistant Secretaries look after a division, then the Assistant Secretary looks after the branches, then the Director looks after sections, and Assistant Directors look after the subsections or the sub-teams of those sections. And the departmental officers are the workers and basically everyone who does the real work. somewhat tongue-in-cheek. The Health Benefits Group, who is this within the department? Well, they ensure that all medicines, medical devices and procedures are accessible to all Australians. So that's what they do. The Health Benefits Group has basically got 4 divisions. The Medical Benefits Division, which mostly looks after the medtech side, which is what Sarah was speaking about earlier. Provider Benefits Integrity Division. The new Technology and Assessment and Access Division, which is the old Pharmaceutical Benefits Division. And I'll explain a bit more about that on the next slide. And the Office of Chemical Safety. So the old Pharmaceutical Benefits Division, PBD, is now rebranded as the Technology Assessment and Access Division, TAAD. So this division has 4 branches. The newly created Office of Health Technology, OHTA or OTA, and it has 2 groups to it, or 2 sections. There's the Assessment branch, or the Assessment section, that's headed by Harry Rutherford, and then the Policy section, which is headed by Louise Clark. Then the other branch is the Policy and PBS Pricing branch, headed by Lisa Laurence. We'll be talking a bit more about the pricing in the next slides. And then the 4th branch in this division is the Pharmacy and Private Health Insurance branch, headed up by Julian Quain. So let's move on to the Medicines Australia and Australian Government Strategic Agreement, or Compact, which was signed earlier this year in 2017. It expires 30th of June 2022, and it has wide-ranging implications and issues, but the main underpinnings of it are listed there on the right-hand side. It's to support and extend additional F1 statutory price reductions, including increasing the price decrease or price reduction from 16 to 25%. It'll be those 2 things we'll be concentrating on this webinar. But the government has also undertaken not to pursue the formation of new therapeutic groups during this agreement term, and continue to work with the industry group on PBS stewardship measures, such as increasing the transparency of processes and instigating or introducing more sophisticated e-prescribing software. And all of it to be overseen by a joint oversight committee between the 2 groups, the government and Medicines Australia. So let's move on to these pricing agreements. And what are they? The first thing to point out is that they all require legislation. So at the moment, they're all mooted to be happening. No one has seen the legislation, but they're all coming. So the 5 pillars are: the anniversary of reductions for F1 drugs will be 5, 10, and 15 years. There'll be an increase to the 25% reduction on listing of the first generic. There are new presentation rules, and there's also ministerial discretion, which is new, and the price disclosure threshold change, which I won't go into on this webinar. It requires a lot more time for explanation and so forth. You'll notice also, I forgot to mention on the slides, there's a source at the bottom. It's all publicly available information on various websites, so you can click on those and read a lot more of the detail and look at case studies as well. So the anniversary reductions of the F1 Formulary 1 medicines. So the current 5% reduction is being extended to 2022. So, however, there will be additional reductions. So at the 10-year anniversary, there will be an additional 10% reduction for these medicines. And at the 15-year anniversary, there will be a further 5% reduction. There's also the provision for a catch-up reduction, 1st of June 2018, next year, which is a one-off 10% for F1 medicines listed since the 1st of June 2008. So it's like a grab all. And then a further one-off 5% for F1 medicines listed on or before June 2003. So after this initial June 1st, 2018 catch-up, it's when the 10 and 15-year Formulary 1 statutory price reductions will come into effect, which we just talked about in that second bullet point. And they will occur on the 1st of April of each year from 1919 to 2021. And you'll see that it doesn't include the last year of that agreement for some reason. If you recall it, the agreement goes out to 2022. But that may all change with the legislation. We wait to see. Okay, so another big impact for the industry will be the first generic reduction change. So currently, when a first generic brand is listed, it triggers an automatic 16% reduction across all the brands. From the 1st of October 2018, this reduction will be 25%. It is mooted that when the agreement ends on the 30th of June 2022, this statutory price reduction will revert back to its 16%. We shall see. The first generic reduction rules have always been a bit of a bugbear to everybody concerned, well, not the government, but the industry. The current rules have been that any new brand that is bioequivalent and or biosimilar to an existing brand is considered a first generic, and as such triggers this reduction, the 16% reduction. And this included new presentations listed by the actual same manufacturer of an existing brand. So a new strength of cartridge, for instance, would trigger the 16% reduction. However, when the legislation is into force and comes into effect, there are a few potential listing issues or options. So prior to that 5th anniversary of listing of the drug, new presentations listed by the same manufacturer of an existing brand will not trigger the 25% price reduction. However, when the branded drug is on the PBS and between its 5th and 10th anniversary, listing of a new presentation, the minister has the discretion not to trigger the price decrease. However, the discretion is also there to trigger it. And then from the 10th anniversary onwards, a new presentation will trigger that 25% reduction. So there is some added complexity, but some flexibility of when this price decrease will happen for a new presentation. The other new mooted legislation is the issue of ministerial discretion. At the moment, there is no ministerial discretion for any anniversary or first generic price reductions. They're automatic as per the statutory legislation. However, when the legislation does take effect, it will allow the minister of the time to have a discretion to not reduce and or not apply the price reductions, as we just mentioned. So when the legislation is finally passed and made public and put into law, the department has agreed that they will release a list of the F1 medicines and also the catch-up anniversary price reductions that are likely to take effect on the 1st of June 2018 and any subsequent reduction days and anniversary reduction days. And obviously, they will provide greater detail on the ministerial discretion arrangements, exactly how that will work in the real world. So does that impact the pathway for pharmaceuticals that have gone through the PBAC process? Not really when it comes to the budget impact. Drugs that cost over 20 million in any future years will still need cabinet approval. Drug costs budgets that are under 20 million in all future years, the minister will be able to have listing power or agreement. Any savings from the pharmaceuticals being listed, the Minister will be able to enact that and pass it through. And if there's nil financial impact, the delegate of the department is still able to list the product. So what about the moving to the compact or the agreement between GBMA and the Australian government? Essentially, there's 4 pillars, and it also expires at the same time as the Medicines Australia, that is the 30th of June 2022. So the 4 pillars are biosimilar uptake drivers, which we will be concentrating here in this webinar on the next few slides. There's a price disclosure moratorium. Again, similar to Medicines Australia, an e-prescribing investment initiative, and the continuation of the generic medicines working group between the two groups. So some of the key principles on the prescribing of the biosimilar uptakes, again, 4 pillars underpin it. The main one at the first is the physicians and other prescribers will retain, in consultation with their patients, to essentially still choose their brand of choice, which one they want to prescribe. But they can also continue to tick the no substitution box on a prescription. So that means that the prescribed brand must be dispensed when an equivalent brand could otherwise be substituted by the pharmacist. We'll talk a little bit about that more later on. Uptake drivers are considered by the PBAC on a case-by-case basis with regard to the evidence and context and recommendations to the Minister. And the interesting one will be that existing authority requirements for reference brands products will not be increased. So you will get to that little bit as well, what that means. The idea is, the last pillar is really that the government believes that greater use of biosimilars is beneficial to supporting access to clinically and cost-effective medicines in Australia and investing time and money in that initiative. So what are the biosimilar uptake drivers and how are they being implemented? Well, the 2 main ones are encouraging the prescribing of a biosimilar brand rather than the reference brand for treatment of naive patients. And then secondly, to provide a simpler and faster approval process for prescribing the biosimilar brands. The main way is through a streamlined authority. We'll get to that in a minute. While maintaining an existing higher level or more complex level of authority required for the reference product, i.e. written authority. Streamlines are less onerous. And also, the biosimilars can still be A-flagged, or little A flag, which means that when they have a little A flag, the brands may be substituted by a pharmacist within each of the PBS item listings if the prescription has not been ticked no brand substitution by the physician. And I've just got the Enbrel Brenzis example here, Tanacept, up on the slide so you can see what the actual A flagging looks like on the PBS. And we'll stick with Tanacept because it's kind of the first product to be actively looked at by the department for uptake drivers. Which brings me to the next slide. So it is actually the first time or the first application of the biosimilar uptake drivers for biosimilar Brenzis, which is Etanercept. So the first thing you'll notice, and it's come into effect the 1st of December of this year, a few days ago. So the addition of an administrative note for the prescribers on the schedule, the PBS. So the note reflects that in the listing for the initial treatment with Etanercept, and there's a specific wording that says biosimilar prescribing policy. And it's important because you can see the text is prescribing of the biosimilar brand Brenzis is encouraged for the treatment of naive patients and so forth. Encouraging biosimilar prescribing for treatment naive patients is government policy. A viable biosimilar market is expected to result in reduced costs for biological medicines, allowing the government to invest in future treatments. That's word for word that you'll see on the PBS, and you can see there's a link to the government's biosimilars webpage. Then more importantly, the second part of it is that the biosimilar etanercept, Brenzis, can be written as an authority-required streamline code for subsequent continuing treatment. We'll get to that in a minute. It means it's easier for the Brenzis prescription. However, there are unchanged authority levels for Enbrel for continuing. It has to be written. Both Enbrel and Brenzis have to be written for the first and the first continuing, the initial and the first continuing treatment. And then obviously Enbrel is the sole etanercept for juvenile indications. However, the government's trying to say that the prescribers really, in consultation with their patients, still have the choice of which brand to prescribe. It's not mandatory, it's encouraged, is the key point there. So what does that mean? What does it look like for Brenzis? Well, this is a simple table taken from the department's website, but you can see at the bottom, Enbrel and Brenzis have got the little A for adult indications. The initial treatment and the first continuing treatment is a written authority. However, you'll see for the subsequent continuing treatment, for the ongoing subsequent continuing, Brenzis is streamlined. So it's less administrative hurdle for the prescriber to write a continuing Brenzis script than it is for Enbrel, which has to be a written authority script. And similarly, the other interesting thing is because of this differentiation at the script writing level, the Brenzis and Enbrel codes are no longer little a flagged. That is, they are not able to be substituted at the pharmacy, so that the prescriber doesn't even need to write or tick the no substitution box. By writing a Brenzis streamlined authority script, the patient will get Brenzis. So that's just a quick update on some of the policy, some of the issues in the pharmaceutical industry here in Australia. So similar to Sarah, I thought I'd look forward to some 2018 issues and things we're looking out for. First one is actually the implementation of the pricing policies and the legislation and the rules that will be coming around it, and how much they stick to the agreement that was forged with Medicines Australia. See if there's any changes. If you recall last year, for everyone who was on, we talked a lot about the Life Savings Drug Program post-market review and the report that was coming, and there will be update reform. We're still waiting to see that. I'm hoping it gets released with some action items for 2018 and beyond, or not, or left alone. Another important thing that happened in Australia was the TGA starting a priority review pathway program for new chemical entities, essentially priority review like in the US. And I think the interesting thing will be what the impact will be on PBS, PBAC pathway and timelines, positive or negative. We'll be monitoring that closely and hopefully report back in our 4th annual update webinar. There will be a 4th one. One other topic we didn't touch on was the PBAC agenda continues to increase, and this year there's been a lot of submissions, special meetings, deferrals and so forth. So we will continue to monitor that and maybe report back in a little bit more detail next year. And lastly, I think the biosimilars uptake, use, utilisation initiatives will continue to be a source of interest and discussion. And I'm sure there will be much, much more to be discussed and talked about in the pharmaceutical, medtech, biotech world in Australia in 2018. And we look forward to seeing you again for our 4th annual update meeting. So thank you again for your time and questions. And sorry, and thank you for your time and efforts. And I just wanted to say, please email us, telephone us for follow-up discussions and questions. More than happy to give some of our initial time for an initial discussion and help you with your needs and wants. So thank you once again. On behalf of Sarah, I will say thank you, and we'll see you all again next year, and we'll be sharing the slides and the recording with our devoted followers very, very shortly. Thank you.